You walked into my city carrying something. I want to know who sent you. Right now.
The same people who are coming for you whether I speak or not.
Whatever you are carrying, Chair, whatever you came here to do, look me in the eye and tell me it meant nothing.
It meant everything. That is exactly why I could not finish it.
You have 30 seconds to tell me the truth before I stop being the one keeping you alive. The voice came from behind her. Zara did not turn around. She stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of the 31st floor apartment, both hands loose at her sides, looking out at the harbour lights scattered across the dark water below like something broken and still beautiful. Her reflection stared back at her from the glass, jaw cut, blood dried at the corner of her mouth, her thick coils falling loose around her face. She looked like a woman who had already survived the worst part of the night. She was not sure that was true. She could see him in her reflection. Kim Jae-won. Standing in the center of the room behind her, hands inside his pockets, platinum blonde hair slightly undone, the tiger tattoo climbing the left side of his neck above his collar. Still. Completely still. The way very dangerous things go still right before they decide to move. 30 seconds, he said again. Quieter this time. That was worse. Somewhere behind him, closer to the door, she could feel Park Hyun-soo. She could not see him in the glass, but she knew he was there, the way you know a fire is somewhere near you. By the heat, by the change in the air. She could hear him breathing. He was not as controlled as his brother. He never had been. And right now, the sound of his breathing told her that whatever was about to happen in this room was the kind of thing that could not be undone once it started. She closed her eyes. She had arrived in Busan 4 months ago with one suitcase and a mission, and the name of a dead man in her phone. And she had told herself she was going to be clean about it. Fast. Precise. Gone before it became anything other than a transaction. It had become everything. Zara. Hyun-soo's voice now. Low. And the thing inside it, the way her name sounded in his mouth like something he was afraid of losing, was the thing that finally made her turn around. She turned and faced them both. 2 men in a high room above the harbour. 2 men who looked at her like they already knew the answer and were giving her the grace of saying it herself. 2 men whose lives she had come to this city to end. She looked at Jae-won first, then at Hyun-soo. Then she breathed in slowly through her nose and she said, "My father's name was Emmanuel Adeyemi. He is the man who killed yours." The harbour was completely silent 31 floors below. Neither of them moved. "And I," she said, "was sent here to finish what he started. Wherever you are watching this, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far a story about a woman who arrived with a mission and left with something she never planned to carry can travel. And if this story found you at a moment when you needed to be reminded that the life you were handed is not the life you are required to live, that sometimes the most dangerous thing a person can do is walk into a room, tell the truth, and stand still while the world decides what to do with it, then you already know why you need to see what happens next. Subscribe, because you just saw the end of who Zara was when she arrived. Now it is time to go back and see how she became this woman standing in this room. And neither, I think, are you ready for all of it. Now let's go back to where it all began. She had arrived in Busan on a Tuesday in October, when the air off the water was cold enough to bite, but the sky was the kind of pale blue that makes you forget, briefly, what trouble you were carrying. She had one suitcase, a Nigerian passport with a Korean visa that had cost someone a great deal of money to arrange, and a name she was supposed to find. She had not arrived as a tourist. She had not arrived as a student. She had arrived as a woman carrying an assignment she had not chosen, wrapped inside a grief she had not yet been permitted to put down, moving through a city that did not know her name and did not know what she had been sent here to do. Zara Adeyemi was 27 years old, and she had her mother's eyes and her father's sins, and she had been living in the space between those two things for as long as she could remember. Her mother, Folake, had been a quiet woman from Lagos, who worked in a small fabric shop in Surulere, and who loved palm wine and bad Nigerian movies, and who had died 3 years ago of a heart that simply gave out, leaving behind a daughter who now knew things about the man who had fathered her that no daughter should ever have to know. Her father, she could not call him that anymore without something acidic rising in her chest, was Emmanuel Adeyemi, a name that meant nothing in the circles she had grown up in, a name that meant everything in certain rooms in Seoul and Busan, and the back offices of organizations that did not have websites or addresses, or any public record of existing at all. Emmanuel had been a fixer, an intermediary, a man who moved between African crime networks and Korean ones with a smile and a handshake, and a gift for making people trust him long enough for it to cost them everything they had. He had died 4 years ago in a car accident that was not an accident, and when he died, the organization he had worked for had decided that his blood debt did not die with him, that his daughter, who had inherited his face and apparently his capacity for disappearing into unfamiliar places and making them feel like somewhere she had always been, was a useful thing to have in their possession. They had found Zara 3 months after her mother's funeral, which was either very precise timing or the kind of cruelty that presents itself as patience. A man named Director Choi had sat across from her in a quiet restaurant on Lagos Island and told her very gently, as if he were explaining something unfortunate but inevitable, that her father had been responsible for the death of a man named Park Sung-jin, the patriarch of one of the most powerful crime families in Busan, and that this debt was known and that it was coming for her eventually, unless she chose to be useful first. Being useful meant going to Busan. It meant finding employment near the Kim Park operations. It meant gathering intelligence. It meant, eventually, when the time was right and the access was sufficient, being present at a particular meeting and pressing a particular button on a particular device. Both brothers, in one room, gone. A clean operation. A statement about the cost of unpaid debts. What Director Choi had not told her. What she had only discovered later, in fragments, in the quiet of her small apartment near Nampodong, was that Park Sung-jin had not been a good man. That he had been, in many ways, the kind of man the world does not mourn honestly. And that the 2 sons he had left behind had not simply inherited an empire. They had inherited a fracture. Kim Jae-won, who had been adopted and given the Kim name but shared blood with the Parks, raised by the patriarch's iron hand and shaped by it in ways that had made him precise and controlled and capable of great coldness. And Park Hyun-soo, the biological son, who had grown up in the shadow of the same man and had turned out entirely different, louder, warmer, more reckless, as if in direct opposition to everything his father had tried to make of the world. These 2 men had split a city between them after their father's death. They had divided the restaurants and the ports and the territories and the grief, and they had not spoken properly in 2 years. And Zara had been sent into the middle of all of it. She found the restaurant the way things find you, when the universe is not finished with you yet. Haenyo sat on a narrow street 3 blocks from the waterfront with paper lanterns strung outside, and a menu that moved between traditional Korean cooking and something that had been touched by whoever had last run the kitchen with real ambition. She knew it was a front within the first week, the back room that stayed locked regardless of how busy the dining room got, the men who came in at hours that had nothing to do with meal times and spoke to the owner in voices too low for the dining room, the cash that moved without receipts and without record. She catalogued all of it. She sent careful, minimal reports to Director Choi's contact number. She told herself she was doing exactly what she had been sent to do. Madame Song hired her without too many questions, which was either a sign of trust or a sign that she saw something in Zara's face that recognized another woman who had learned not to ask too many questions herself. The work steadied her in a way she had not expected. The weight of the trays, the rhythm of the morning prep and the evening close, the Korean vocabulary expanding daily under Madame Song's corrections and occasional approvals. It gave her body something to do while her mind ran its calculations. She was good at both. She had always been good at being multiple things at the same time. She had not expected to love Haenyo. She had not expected the smell of the jjigae in the morning, and the sound of the kitchen at full speed, and the way the lanterns outside turned the street gold in the evening to become things she looked forward to. She had not expected the restaurant to start feeling like somewhere she belonged. That was the most dangerous development of all. And she noted it and kept working and told herself it was useful cover to feel at home, and not that she actually was. She had definitely not expected Park Hyun-soo. He came in on a Wednesday 3 weeks into her time at Haenyo. And he came in the way weather comes in, announcing itself before it arrived, filling the space before his body did. He had 2 men behind him, and a phone pressed to his ear, and a voice that took up the entire restaurant from the moment the door opened, and she turned from the table she was clearing with the quick professional assessment she had trained in herself. A full read of a person in under 3 seconds. Navy suit slightly open at the collar, dark hair pushed back messily, that crane tattoo visible above his collar on the right side of his neck. Broad-shouldered and physical, and carrying the specific energy of a man who has spent his life in rooms where everyone watches him, and has learned to occupy that attention rather than shrink from it. He sat at the center table without being shown to it, which told her everything about his relationship to the building. She brought him water without being asked. It was instinct and also intelligence gathering, and she could no longer fully separate the two. He looked up at her and went completely still. Not the way men sometimes went still when they noticed a beautiful woman. This was different in quality, and she registered the difference immediately. This was the stillness of someone who had been genuinely surprised by something they had not prepared for. Like she was a sentence in a language he did not speak, but understood somewhere below the level of language, in the place where people recognize things before they can explain them. "You're new," he said, in Korean. 3 weeks, she answered, also in Korean, and watched his eyebrows lift. "You speak well." "I studied." "Where are you from?" "Nigeria." He smiled then, full and unguarded and completely without calculation, a smile that changed the entire geometry of his face, and made him look briefly like someone younger than his authority suggested. And she held it in her gaze for exactly 1 second longer than was professional, and then turned away to take the order from the table beside his. Behind her, she heard him say something quiet to his men, and heard one of them laugh, and she kept her pace steady and even, and went to the kitchen and stood at the prep counter, and breathed carefully through her nose and acknowledged, privately and with some alarm, that she was already in a specific kind of trouble. He came back on Friday. He came back the following Wednesday. He started arriving alone. He started sitting at the same table. He started ordering whatever she recommended, which was either genuine trust or an elaborate excuse to keep talking to her, and she suspected it was both in proportions she could not precisely measure. It was raining hard 3 Wednesdays into this pattern, when she had to run to the street entrance for something, and he appeared at the kitchen entrance before she reached it, and before she could register what was happening, his jacket was over her head, and he was holding it there with one arm raised above her, his body warm and close in the cold, wet air, smelling of something expensive and clean underneath the rain. She turned beneath the jacket to look up at him, and they were suddenly much closer than the logistics of the situation required, and the rain was loud on the awning above them, and his dark eyes were right there, amused and warm and very focused, and the crane tattoo was at his throat, and she told herself to step back and create appropriate professional distance. She did not step back. "I have an umbrella inside," she said. "Too far," he said, and the smile was already there. They stood under his jacket in the rain for a duration that was entirely too long for the situation to remain professional, and she memorized his face against her will, and told herself she was reading a subject, and not a person, and then stepped back inside, and felt the warmth of where he had been standing for the next 30 minutes. Kim Jae-won came for the first time on a Thursday, 6 weeks into her employment, and he came the way very controlled things move, quietly, with intention, without announcing anything. He sat at the table near the window, ordered green tea and John, opened a leather folder of documents, and did not look up for the first 20 minutes she was aware of him. Black, suit perfectly tailored, platinum blonde hair immaculate, the tiger tattoo visible at his collar on the left side when she set his tea down. She recognized him from the description she had been given, and her pulse did something she did not have a professional explanation for. He looked up when she set the cup down. A single glance, brief and precise. He looked back at his documents. Then, slowly, as if against a specific internal instruction, he looked up again. "Thank you," he said. Quiet, controlled, measured. "Of course," she said. She walked the full length of the dining room back to the kitchen and felt his attention on her back the entire way, a quality of focus so concentrated it was almost physical. She went to the kitchen and stood at the prep counter and pressed her palms flat on the cool surface, and told herself 4 times that this was information gathering. She did not believe herself once. He came back every Thursday. He never came on Wednesdays. Hyun-soo never came on Thursdays. She noticed this pattern before she understood it, and when she understood it, that they had divided even this restaurant between them the way they had divided the city, silently and completely. The knowledge settled into her chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through everything she thought she understood about what she was doing here. Hyun-soo asked her to walk with him on an evening in November, when the ginkgo trees had turned the street outside Haenyeo entirely gold. He asked in the way that people who are not accustomed to asking for things ask, directly, with his expression arranged in a studied casualness that was not casual at all. "It is too cold," she said. "I'll keep you warm," he said, with the grin already assembled. "That is a terrible line. I know, I'm better in person." She walked with him. He bought tteokbokki from a street vendor, and they ate standing up in the cold with the rice cakes burning their fingers, and he talked about Busan the way people talk about a place they love and resent in equal measure, which is to say the way people talk about home. He knew every street and every smell and every back alley, and he hated that he knew all of it and could not imagine being anywhere else. He told her about growing up near the water. He told her his mother had died when he was 8, and that after that the sea had been the only thing that felt entirely honest to him, because it did not pretend to be anything other than what it was. He told her there were very few things in his life that had ever felt that honest. He was looking directly at her when he said that last part. She looked back at him in the gold and dark of that Busan street, rice cake grease on both their fingers and cold air turning their breath visible, and she thought, "You should not be telling me these things. You should not be looking at me this way. I am going to destroy your life and your brother's life and everything your dead father built, and you do not know that yet. And the only reason we are both still standing here in the warm light is because you do not know it yet." She said, "My mother died when I was 24. He went quiet and still, and nodded slowly, and the silence that followed was worth more than anything he could have said. They walked back slowly, and he did not reach for her hand, and she understood that this restraint was costing him something, that he was capable of it even when it went against everything his nature wanted, and she filed that away in the part of her that was still attempting to see him only as a subject of intelligence gathering. That part of her was losing badly. Hyun-soo kissed her for the first time 2 weeks after that walk. It was not planned. Nothing about Hyun-soo was planned. They had come back from the Pojangmacha by the water, soju and warmth, and his hand brushing hers 3 times on the table, without either of them acknowledging it, and he had stopped walking on the way back, and she had taken 2 steps before realizing, and turned to find him standing on the pavement looking at her, with an expression so completely undefended that it stopped her mid-step. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "You. Just you standing there." She looked at him in the dark Busan street with his hands in his pockets, and his dark hair pushed back by the wind, and the crane tattoo above his collar, and she thought, "You are going to ruin me." She thought, "I am going to ruin you first, and I am so deeply, irreparably sorry for it." He closed the space between them in 2 steps and kissed her, warm and certain and tasting of soju, and something fiercer and more permanent underneath. And she kissed him back with her hands pressing flat against his chest, feeling the solid reality of him and her eyes burning with something that had nothing to do with the cold wind. He pulled back and rested his forehead against hers and held it there, and they stood in that suspended moment, with their breath mingling in the cold air, and neither of them said anything, and the harbour was dark and distant, and the city was alive around them, and she thought, "I cannot do this. I am already doing this. There is no version of stopping this that I know how to execute anymore." She went home and stood at her window and pressed her forehead against the cold glass and said, in Yoruba, very quietly, "Mama, what have I done?" Jaewon touched her hand on a Thursday in mid-December. She had set his tea down, and he had reached for it at the exact same moment, and his fingers closed around the cup precisely where hers still rested, and neither of them moved for a moment that was 3 seconds long and contained an entire conversation. She released the cup. He lifted it. Neither of them spoke, but something had been declared in that silence, something that existed below the level of language, in the register where people acknowledge things they are not yet prepared to say out loud. He walked her to the bus stop that evening for the first time. His men trailed at a respectful distance, and the winter city was quiet around them, and he walked beside her with his hands in his pockets, and said nothing for 2 full blocks. And she matched his silence because she had already understood that silence with Jaewon was not empty. It was its own kind of presence. It was what he gave you when words were insufficient. At the bus stop, he turned to face her and looked at her with those dark eyes that processed everything. "You are not afraid of me," he said. Should I be? He considered this genuinely. Most people are. I know, she said. And yet, she agreed. The bus came and she got on and looked back from the window, and he was standing at the stop with his hands in his pockets and the tiger tattoo at his jaw and his platinum hair in the winter dark, watching the bus go until it turned the corner. And she closed her eyes and felt something inside her chest vibrate like a wire that had been struck by something it had been waiting for. She was somewhere between falling and fallen, and she could no longer measure the distance between the two states. And she was not sure, standing in that knowledge, that she wanted to. Jaewon spoke to her for the first time beyond the transactional on a different Thursday, when she was clearing the table beside his, and he said without looking up from his documents, "You are always watching." She stopped. "I am a waitress." "Not the way you watch." He turned a page. "You watch the exits. You count the men. You clock every person who comes through the back." She kept her face still. "You count the men too." He looked up then, slowly and deliberately. "Yes," he said, "I do." He held her gaze for a moment, and in it was the beginning of a question he was not yet ready to ask. "We have that in common." She walked away, and her hands were steady, and her heart was not. And that gap between the two was getting wider every week. He gave her his umbrella one Thursday when it started raining as she was leaving, and he was still at his table. She started to say something, and he said, without looking up, "I have a car." And she stood in the doorway of Haenya with his umbrella in her hand, and looked back at him and felt the warmth of that small, deliberate thing spread through her, like something she had been cold without for a long time. Hyun-soo came to find her on a night in late December, when she was closing the restaurant alone. She heard the back door and turned with a prep knife already in her hand, fast and low and ready. And he stopped dead in the doorway with both hands raised and looked at the knife, and then at her face, and said nothing for a moment. "Remind me never to startle you," he said. She lowered the knife slowly. Her heart was loud. "You should knock." "I did. You didn't hear me." He came in slowly, reading her face in the dim restaurant light. "What happened tonight? You look like you've been carrying something all evening." "I am always carrying something." He crossed the restaurant in 8 deliberate steps and stood in front of her, and put both hands on her shoulders and looked at her with that full, unguarded attention she could never fully prepare herself for. The crane tattoo was at his collar, and his dark eyes were steady, and she felt the weight of everything she was carrying shift slightly, as if his presence alone was redistributing it across more surface area. "Let me help," he said, simply, without conditions. She looked at him and wanted to say yes. She wanted to give him every piece of it. Instead, she reached up and took his face in her hands and kissed him, and it was different from the first time. Slower, more deliberate, less recklessness and more intention. The kind of kiss that is a statement rather than a question. He made a sound low in his chest and pulled her in closer, and she felt his arms come around her, and the warmth of his body in the cold, empty restaurant, and she thought, "I will remember this exact moment. Whatever happens after this, whatever I have to become, and whatever I lose in becoming it, I will remember his arms and the smell of the harbour through the walls and the upturned chairs around us like silent witnesses." He pulled back and pressed his lips to her forehead and held them there. She closed her eyes. "Zara," he said into her hair. "Don't," she whispered. "Don't what?" "Don't say the big thing yet. Not yet." He held her tighter and said nothing, and she was grateful beyond what words could reach. January arrived, and the shift in everything came before she could fully prepare for it. More traffic through the back of the restaurant. Different men on different days, carrying the specific body language of people on the edge of something. Hyun-soo came in some nights with his jaw set and his eyes somewhere else, and one Wednesday, 2 men came in behind him with the deliberate body language of a confrontation that had been decided before they walked through the door. She watched from the dining room as Hyun-soo turned before they reached him. He turned slowly, almost lazily, as if he had eyes in the back of his head, which, she was beginning to understand, he effectively did. The first man grabbed his collar, and the sequence that followed was so fast it looked choreographed. Hyun-soo's elbow went backward into the man's jaw before the grip fully tightened. He pivoted on his left foot, caught the second man's swinging arm at the wrist, locked it, turned his whole body into the movement, and the man folded to his knees on the restaurant floor with the sound of something being asked to bend in a direction it refused. Hyun-soo stood over both of them and straightened his suit jacket with both hands and looked at Madame Song in the kitchen doorway. "I'll pay for the floor," he said. "There is nothing wrong with the floor," she said. "Get them out." He got them out. He came back and sat at his table, and she brought him water without being asked, exactly as she had the very first night, and he looked up at her and the grin was there, that infuriating, impossible, completely genuine grin, and she shook her head and walked away, and heard him laugh quietly behind her, and felt warmth move through her chest, like something she could not afford. Jae-won intervened for her on a Thursday in January, and he did it so efficiently, and with so little performance, that she almost did not register it as what it was. A man had been watching her from a corner table all evening. Thick-necked, expensive watch. The specific entitlement of someone who has never needed to consider whether a room wanted him in it. When she came past with a loaded tray, he stepped into her path and said something in dialect she did not catch, but understood completely from tone and posture, and she set the tray on the nearest surface and turned to face him and said in clear, precise Korean, "Move." He smiled, instead of moving. The kind of smile that is a declaration of what he believes the power structure to be. He reached out and put his hand on her arm. The next thing she registered was Jae-won behind the man, having crossed the entire dining room in the time it took the hand to extend, holding him by the collar with one hand in the efficient, unhurried manner of someone performing a task they find mildly inconvenient. He turned the man toward the door and walked him out without a word. The man's 3 companions read the room and followed immediately. Jae-won came back and bent down and collected the items that had slid from her tray and set them on the table, and then looked at her. "I was handling it," she said. "I know," he said. "You didn't have to do that." "I know." And then, so quietly it was almost to himself, "I know you were. I did it anyway." She looked at him, at this precise, controlled, devastatingly careful man who had just crossed a room for her without making it a statement, without requiring acknowledgement, without asking for anything in return. And something in the wall she maintained between what she was permitted to feel and what she actually felt developed a crack she could not repair. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once and returned to his table and picked up his documents, and she stood in the center of the dining room, with her heart doing things that had nothing to do with professional intelligence work. That night he walked with her to the bus stop, and at the stop he turned and reached out, and with 2 fingers turned her face gently toward the streetlight, and looked at her arm where the man had grabbed her. His touch was barely a touch at all, a ghost of contact, his thumb a whisper against her skin as he checked. She watched his face while he looked, and his expression was the most open she had ever seen it. Not fully open. Jae-won was never fully open. But the door was cracked, and through the crack was something enormous, and carefully maintained and completely real. He released her face and put his hand back in his pocket, and looked at the street and said nothing. "It is nothing," she said. "I know," he said. He did not look